In the bustling downtown courthouse of a mid-sized American city, the morning sun filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden benches. The atmosphere was tense as people shuffled in and out of various courtrooms, their footsteps echoing off the marble floors. Among them was Mrs. Chen, a 73-year-old grandmother who had never imagined she'd find herself in court over a simple parking dispute. Her gentle demeanor and traditional floral dress seemed out of place in the stern environment. She clutched her purse tightly, her arthritis-riddled fingers trembling slightly as she waited for her case to be called. The ticket in question was for parking in what she believed was a legal spot outside her grandson's school, where she'd been volunteering in the library. Judge Richard Thompson presided over the morning's proceedings with an air of impatience. Known throughout the legal community for his strict adherence to rules and sometimes harsh demeanor, he had served on the bench for over 2 decades. What many didn't know was that he'd been under increasing pressure from the Judicial Review Board for his controversial conduct in recent months. As Mrs. Chen's case was called, she slowly made her way to the front of the courtroom, using her cane for support. The fluorescent lights highlighted the silver in her hair as she bowed slightly to the judge, a habit from her years growing up in Taiwan. This simple gesture of respect seemed to irritate Judge Thompson, whose face noticeably tightened. "Stand up straight when you're in my courtroom," he snapped, his voice carrying across the silent chamber. Several heads turned, and a young law clerk shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Mrs. Chen straightened as best she could, though her back pain made it difficult. "Your Honor," she began softly, her accent thick but clear, "would like to explain about the parking." "Speak up." Judge Thompson interrupted, his face reddening. "This is a courtroom, not a tea house. If you can't communicate properly, you shouldn't be driving in this country at all." The outburst sent shockwaves through the courtroom. A few gasps could be heard from the gallery, and the court reporter's fingers froze over her stenotype machine. Mrs. Chen's eyes welled with tears, but she held her composure, standing as tall as her elderly frame would allow. What happened next would change the course of both their lives. A young public defender, who had been observing cases that morning, stood up from his seat. His movement drew everyone's attention, including Judge Thompson's increasingly angry glare. "Your Honor," the public defender spoke firmly, "I'd like to represent Mrs. Chen pro bono, and I move for an immediate recess to discuss your conduct with the chief judge." The courtroom fell deadly silent. Judge Thompson's face drained of color as he realized his outburst had been recorded not only by the court reporter but also by several smartphones in the gallery. One spectator, a local journalism student, was already typing frantically on her phone, live-tweeting the entire incident. Mrs. Chen stood quietly, her dignity intact despite the judge's verbal assault. She had lived through much worse in her life, including escaping political turmoil in her youth and building a new life in America. The judge's words stung, but they also awakened something in the courtroom, a collective conscience that would not stand for such behavior. As the morning proceeded, word of the incident spread through the courthouse like wildfire. Court officers whispered in corridors, legal assistants exchanged knowing looks, and a small crowd of reporters began gathering outside. The story of the elderly volunteer grandmother and the judge who publicly berated her was about to become much bigger than a simple parking ticket dispute. In the next hour, security footage from the courtroom would be requested by 3 different news outlets, the chief judge would receive dozens of calls and emails, and Mrs. Chen's grandson, a social media manager for a tech company, would be rushing to the courthouse, determined to ensure his grandmother's story would not go unheard. By early afternoon, the morning's events had transformed from a local courthouse incident into a social media phenomenon. Mrs. Chen's grandson, David, sat beside her in a small conference room, his laptop open as he watched the video of the courtroom incident surpass 100,000 views. His grandmother sipped green tea from a paper cup, maintaining the same quiet dignity she'd shown in the courtroom. "Grandmother, you don't have to stay here," David said softly in Mandarin, touching her hand. "We can go home and let the lawyers handle this." But Mrs. Chen shook her head, her expression serene despite the chaos unfolding around her. "When I first came to this country," she replied, switching to English, "I promised myself I would never run from injustice again. This isn't just about me anymore." Outside the conference room, the courthouse had become a hive of activity. The chief judge, Patricia Rivera, had called an emergency meeting with the Judicial Conduct Committee. The recording of Judge Thompson's outburst played on a large screen in the conference room, his words echoing off the walls, "This is a courtroom, not a tea house." Judge Rivera massaged her temples as she listened to the playback. In her 25 years on the bench, she'd dealt with numerous judicial conduct issues, but none had garnered such immediate public attention. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from other judges, local politicians, and media outlets seeking comment. Meanwhile, Judge Thompson sat alone in his chambers, his face ashen as he watched the incident go viral on his computer screen. Social media users were already digging up his past cases, finding patterns of similar behavior toward minorities and elderly defendants. His secretary had stopped answering his phone after the fifth angry call from local community leaders. The young public defender who had stood up for Mrs. Chen, James Park, was now surrounded by a small group of colleagues in the courthouse cafeteria. "I couldn't just sit there," he explained, pushing his untouched coffee aside. "You know how many times I've seen him do this to people who couldn't defend themselves. But this time he picked on the wrong person." Indeed, Mrs. Chen's background made the judge's actions look even worse. Local news outlets had quickly discovered that she volunteered not only at her grandson's school but also at 3 different community organizations. She taught English to new immigrants on weekends and helped run a food bank for elderly residents. The parking ticket she'd received was from the one day she'd stayed late at the school, helping a young student with reading difficulties. As the afternoon wore on, courthouse security had to deal with a growing crowd outside. Community leaders and civil rights activists had begun to gather, holding handmade signs demanding Judge Thompson's resignation. Local news vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. Inside, David showed his grandmother some of the supportive messages flooding in from around the country. People shared stories of their own immigrant grandparents, of facing discrimination in courtrooms, and of standing up to authority. A local Chinese-American community group had already offered to pay any fines associated with her parking ticket, though that now seemed like the least of anyone's concerns. The chief judge's office received an unexpected call from the governor's office. The incident had caught the attention of state officials, who were concerned about the implications for the judiciary's reputation. Judge Thompson's history of complaints, previously buried in administrative files, was now being scrutinized at the highest levels. Mrs. Chen's quiet strength throughout the ordeal touched something deep in the public consciousness. Here was a woman who had spent decades contributing to her adopted country, only to face public humiliation for a minor infraction. The contrast between her dignity and the judge's prejudice created a narrative that resonated far beyond the courthouse walls. By late afternoon, several major civil rights organizations had reached out to Mrs. Chen's family, offering legal support and advocacy. The courthouse administration scrambled to handle the mounting pressure, knowing that their response to this incident would set a precedent for handling judicial misconduct in the age of social media. Judge Thompson finally emerged from his chambers around 4 o'clock, escorted by court officers through back corridors to avoid the crowds. His face had lost its usual stern expression, replaced by something that looked remarkably like fear. As he passed the conference room where Mrs. Chen sat with her grandson, he paused for a moment, his hand twitching as if he might knock. But he continued walking, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The incident had sparked a larger conversation about respect, dignity, and power in the justice system. Legal blogs began publishing articles about the history of discrimination in courtrooms, and law professors across the country were already planning to use the video in their ethics classes. As the day drew to a close, Mrs. Chen stood at the courthouse window, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. David worked nearby on press statements with a pro bono legal team that had assembled to handle the case. The parking ticket that had brought them there seemed almost laughable now, a tiny spark that had ignited a much larger fire. "Tomorrow will be interesting," Mrs. Chen said softly, more to herself than anyone else. She hadn't set out to become a symbol or to challenge the system. She had simply refused to be diminished, and in doing so, had given others the courage to speak up about their own experiences with judicial misconduct. The next morning broke with unexpected developments. Judge Thompson's outburst had made national news, with major networks picking up the story. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and camera crews by 7 a.m., their equipment glinting in the morning sun. But the real story was unfolding in less visible places. In a modest apartment across town, another elderly woman watched the viral video for the 10th time, her hands shaking. She was a former defendant in Judge Thompson's courtroom from 6 months ago, when he had dismissed her disability discrimination case with similar contempt. She hadn't told anyone about her experience, too ashamed and defeated to speak up. Now, watching Mrs. Chen's quiet strength, she reached for her phone. Back at the courthouse, Chief Judge Rivera sat in her office reviewing a growing stack of complaints against Judge Thompson. They weren't just recent grievances, people were coming forward with stories from years ago. A court clerk had maintained a private journal documenting the judge's behavior, and now anonymously submitted it to the Judicial Review Board. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Mrs. Chen's story had opened a floodgate. The public defender's office began compiling a database of cases where Judge Thompson had shown similar bias. They found a disturbing trend: elderly defendants, immigrants, and disabled individuals had consistently received harsher treatment in his courtroom. The numbers told a story that couldn't be explained away by coincidence. Meanwhile, Mrs. Chen's grandson David was struggling to manage the overwhelming support pouring in from around the country. His grandmother's email inbox was flooded with messages from other Asian American seniors sharing their own courthouse experiences. A group of law students from a nearby university offered to translate these stories into English, creating a powerful document of systemic bias. Judge Thompson himself had called in sick, but his absence only fueled more speculation. Local news outlets discovered that he lived in an exclusive gated community and had a history of complaints from his neighbors about his treatment of their household staff. His carefully crafted image of stern professionalism was crumbling under scrutiny. By midday, the story had taken another turn. A retired court interpreter came forward with recordings of Judge Thompson making inappropriate comments when he thought non-English speakers couldn't understand him. The recordings had been sitting in a drawer for years. The interpreter had been afraid of losing her job if she spoke up. Mrs. Chen, meanwhile, had returned to her volunteer work at the school library. When asked why she didn't take time off to deal with the media attention, she simply smiled and said, "The children are expecting me. Their books won't read themselves." Her commitment to her routine in the face of chaos earned her even more public admiration. The local bar association called an emergency meeting to discuss the implications of the incident. Young lawyers shared stories of avoiding Judge Thompson's courtroom, knowing their elderly or immigrant clients would face unfair treatment. One attorney admitted to settling cases for less than they were worth just to avoid facing the judge's prejudice. In the courthouse cafeteria, the conversation turned to broader issues of accountability in the justice system. Court staff who had witnessed similar incidents for years now felt empowered to speak up. A young bailiff revealed how he'd been reprimanded for helping an elderly defendant to their seat in Thompson's courtroom. The public defender who had stood up for Mrs. Chen, James Park, found himself thrust into the spotlight. Other lawyers sought his advice on handling similar situations. "It's not about being a hero," he told them during an impromptu gathering. "It's about remembering why we chose this profession in the first place, to ensure justice for everyone." As the day progressed, more community organizations joined the growing movement. A local tech company offered to create a website where people could safely share their courthouse experiences. Civil rights organizations began planning workshops on knowing your rights in court. What had started as one judge's outburst was evolving into a larger conversation about justice and dignity. Mrs. Chen's family history added another layer to the story. Journalists discovered that her late husband had been a civil rights advocate in Taiwan, standing up against authoritarianism in the 1960s. She had carried his spirit of quiet resistance with her to America, though she never sought attention for herself. By late afternoon, the Judicial Review Board announced an official investigation into Judge Thompson's conduct. But for many, the real victory wasn't just about one judge's behavior, it was about breaking the silence that had protected such conduct for years. In the school library, Mrs. Chen sat with a young student, helping him sound out difficult words in a book about courage. The boy looked up at her and asked, "Are you the lady from the news?" She nodded, then pointed back to the page. "Let's finish this chapter," she said gently. "Every story needs a proper ending." Outside, the media circus continued, but within the library's quiet walls, Mrs. Chen demonstrated the same dedication to service that had earned her such widespread support. Her simple act of maintaining her dignity in the face of prejudice had sparked a movement, though she would be the last to call it that. 3 days after the incident, the story took an unexpected turn. A former law clerk of Judge Thompson's, who had worked in his chambers 5 years ago, came forward with detailed notes and emails documenting a pattern of discriminatory behavior. The clerk, now a successful attorney in another state, had kept the evidence out of fear that speaking up would damage their career. The documents revealed something even more disturbing. Judge Thompson had actively worked to ensure that certain types of cases, particularly those involving elderly immigrants or non-native English speakers, were assigned to his courtroom. He had cultivated relationships with court administrators who could influence case assignments, using his seniority and influence to create what amounted to a systemic bias in the justice system. Mrs. Chen's case had become the thread that unraveled this carefully constructed web. The Chief Judge's office was now reviewing hundreds of past cases, looking for patterns of prejudicial treatment. The task was daunting, but volunteers from local law schools offered to help, seeing it as a real-world lesson in judicial accountability. Meanwhile, Mrs. Chen's influence continued to grow in unexpected ways. A group of elderly immigrants who had faced similar treatment in various courtrooms across the state began meeting regularly at a local community center. They called themselves the Dignity Group, sharing their stories and supporting each other through legal challenges. Mrs. Chen attended their first meeting, bringing her homemade almond cookies and a quiet wisdom that put everyone at ease. The school where Mrs. Chen volunteered had become an unlikely center of civic education. Teachers used her experience to discuss citizenship, justice, and standing up to discrimination. The children were particularly impressed that their gentle library volunteer had sparked such important changes. One 6th grader started a "Kindness in Action" club, inspired by Mrs. Chen's example of quiet strength. Judge Thompson finally broke his silence, issuing a carefully worded statement through his attorney. He expressed regret for any misunderstanding and cited the stress of his heavy caseload. The response only fueled more criticism, with legal experts pointing out that his statement showed a fundamental lack of understanding about why his behavior was problematic. The courthouse itself was undergoing changes. The chief judge implemented mandatory cultural sensitivity training for all court personnel, from judges to security officers. Signs in multiple languages were posted throughout the building, explaining court procedures and defendants' rights. A new position was created for a community liaison officer to help make the court system more accessible to all residents. David, Mrs. Chen's grandson, found himself managing not just media requests but also invitations for his grandmother to speak at law schools and civil rights conferences. Mrs. Chen declined most of them, preferring to continue her regular volunteer work. "Change doesn't always need a spotlight," she told David in Mandarin. "Sometimes it grows better in quiet places." The Judicial Review Board's investigation expanded beyond Judge Thompson to examine the broader culture that had allowed his behavior to continue unchecked for so long. Other judges who had witnessed his conduct but remained silent were now facing uncomfortable questions about their own responsibility to maintain judicial integrity. Local law enforcement took notice too. The police department initiated a review of their own interactions with elderly and immigrant residents, acknowledging that the courthouse incident had revealed blind spots in their community relations. They invited Mrs. Chen to speak at a training session, where she shared her perspective on how small acts of respect or disrespect can shape people's trust in institutions. The story reached the state capitol, where legislators began drafting a bill to strengthen judicial oversight and make it easier for people to report misconduct without fear of retaliation. They called it the Judicial Accountability and Respect Act, though some were already referring to it as Mrs. Chen's Law. Support for Mrs. Chen came from unexpected places. A group of court reporters and interpreters formed an advocacy organization to document and address discrimination in the legal system. They developed a secure platform where people could report inappropriate judicial behavior, ensuring that no one else would have to stand alone against injustice. Judge Thompson's private life began to unravel as more details emerged. Former colleagues revealed that his prejudices weren't limited to the courtroom. His country club membership was quietly revoked after several members came forward with stories of his discriminatory comments at social events. The carefully constructed facade of respectability he had maintained for decades crumbled in a matter of weeks. Mrs. Chen, however, showed no interest in personal revenge. When asked about Judge Thompson at a community meeting, she simply said, "Everyone deserves a chance to learn and grow better." Her response was quoted in several national newspapers, striking a chord with readers who saw in her words a path toward healing rather than division. The Dignity Group that had formed in the wake of Mrs. Chen's experience began documenting their stories in a book project. They weren't just sharing tales of discrimination, they were recording their journeys to America, their contributions to their communities, and their hopes for future generations. Mrs. Chen contributed a short chapter, writing about the importance of standing firm in the face of injustice while keeping one's heart open to reconciliation. 1 week after the incident, the story reached a turning point. The state's Judicial Conduct Commission called an emergency hearing to address the mounting evidence against Judge Thompson. The hearing would be public, an unusual step that reflected the intense community interest in the case. The courthouse prepared for what would become a watershed moment in its history. Mrs. Chen received an official invitation to testify, delivered to her home by a court officer who found her tending to her small garden. She was carefully pruning her rose bushes, a hobby she'd maintained for 20 years. Like justice, she told the officer, beautiful things need constant attention to grow properly. The morning of the hearing dawned clear and crisp. The courthouse steps were covered with supporters, many holding hand-painted signs in multiple languages calling for judicial reform. Among them were dozens of elderly community members who had traveled from neighboring cities to show solidarity. They called themselves Mrs. Chen's Army, though she gently reminded them she preferred the term family. Inside the hearing room, Mrs. Chen sat quietly in the front row, wearing the same floral dress she'd worn on the day of the incident. Her grandson David sat beside her, along with James Park, the public defender who had first stood up for her. The room was packed with observers, including law students, community activists, and court employees. Judge Thompson arrived through a side entrance, looking notably different from his usual commanding presence. His shoulders were hunched, his trademark stern expression replaced by one of visible discomfort. His legal team had advised against appearing at the hearing, but he had insisted, perhaps realizing that his absence would speak louder than his presence. The commission began by playing the complete video of the incident. The room fell silent as they watched Judge Thompson's outburst again. But this time, something unexpected happened. As the video played, the focus shifted from the judge's angry words to Mrs. Chen's composed demeanor. Her dignity in the face of humiliation seemed even more remarkable in retrospect. When it was Mrs. Chen's turn to speak, she rose slowly, using her cane for support. Instead of approaching the podium, she turned to face Judge Thompson directly. "I forgive you," she said, her voice clear and steady. "But forgiveness doesn't mean we can forget. We must learn from this moment." The room was stunned. No one had expected her to address the judge directly, much less offer forgiveness. Judge Thompson, for the first time since the incident began, showed real emotion. His eyes welled with tears as Mrs. Chen continued speaking, sharing her story of coming to America, of believing in its promise of justice, and of her determination to help make that promise real for others. As the hearing progressed, more witnesses came forward. A former courthouse janitor revealed how he had observed Judge Thompson's different treatment of defendants based on their background over years of evening cleaning shifts. A court interpreter shared recordings of the judge making dismissive comments about non-English speakers during private chambers conversations. But it was the testimony of a young lawyer that truly shifted the narrative. She described how, as a new attorney 5 years ago, she had witnessed Judge Thompson berating an elderly Vietnamese client. She had stayed silent then, fearing for her career. "Mrs. Chen showed me that silence in the face of injustice makes us complicit," she testified, her voice breaking with emotion. During a break in the proceedings, an unexpected scene unfolded in the courthouse cafeteria. Several judges from other districts, who had come to observe the hearing, approached Mrs. Chen. They asked her to help them understand how they could better serve their diverse communities. She shared simple but powerful suggestions about patience, respect, and the importance of seeing the human being behind each case. The afternoon session brought another surprise. Judge Thompson asked for permission to make an unplanned statement. His prepared remarks forgotten, he spoke from the heart about how Mrs. Chen's forgiveness had forced him to confront his own prejudices. He announced his immediate resignation from the bench and pledged to spend his retirement working with community organizations to promote judicial fairness. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown. Local restaurants delivered food and water to the supporters maintaining their vigil. Children from Mrs. Chen's school library program arrived with their parents, carrying books about justice and equality. They set up an impromptu reading circle on the courthouse lawn, creating a peaceful contrast to the tension inside. The commission's hearing continued into the evening, but its impact was already clear. This wasn't just about one judge's misconduct, it was about transforming a system that had allowed such behavior to flourish. The commissioners announced the formation of a permanent community oversight board to review judicial conduct and make recommendations for systemic changes. As the sun set on this historic day, Mrs. Chen returned to her garden. She had declined numerous interview requests, preferring to let her actions speak louder than words. In her small backyard, she carefully watered her roses, knowing that like justice, they needed constant care to bloom properly. 2 weeks after the hearing, the ripple effects of Mrs. Chen's case continued to spread in unexpected ways. The State Bar Association had organized a special conference titled Dignity in the Courts, and courthouses across the state were implementing new training programs. But the most significant changes were happening at a more personal level. Judge Thompson's resignation had created an opening on the bench, and the governor's office made an unprecedented decision. They established a community advisory panel to help select the new judge, ensuring that voices from all segments of society would be heard in the process. Mrs. Chen was invited to serve on the panel, though she initially hesitated. "I am just a grandmother who speaks up for what is right," she told David when he encouraged her to accept the position. But her grandson reminded her of something she often said to her students: small actions can plant big seeds. After careful consideration, she agreed to participate, seeing it as another way to serve her community. The advisory panel's first meeting brought together a diverse group of community leaders, legal experts, and ordinary citizens. They gathered in the same courtroom where the incident had occurred, but the atmosphere couldn't have been more different. The stern portraits of former judges look down on a lively discussion about what qualities make a truly just judge. Meanwhile, the Dignity Group that had formed in the wake of Mrs. Chen's experience was growing into a powerful grassroots organization. They had opened chapters in neighboring cities, creating support networks for elderly and immigrant residents navigating the legal system. Their members served as courthouse companions, translators, and advocates for those who might otherwise face the system alone. The former law clerk who had exposed Judge Thompson's pattern of discrimination had started a non-profit organization dedicated to judicial accountability. They developed an anonymous reporting system for court employees to safely report misconduct, ensuring that future instances of bias wouldn't go unchallenged for years. The system was already being adopted by other jurisdictions. Mrs. Chen's influence extended beyond the judicial system. Local schools began incorporating her story into their civics curriculum, teaching students about the importance of standing up to injustice while maintaining dignity and compassion. The 6th grade Kindness in Action club she had inspired now had chapters in schools across the district. One morning, Mrs. Chen received an unexpected visitor at the school library. It was Judge Thompson's wife, who had been silent throughout the controversy. She came not to defend her husband but to share her own story of witnessing his behavior over the years and feeling powerless to change it. The two women talked for hours, finding common ground in their shared belief in the possibility of redemption. The courthouse itself was undergoing a physical transformation. The imposing security desk at the entrance was redesigned to be more welcoming. Signs in multiple languages now guided visitors through the building, and a new help desk was staffed by volunteers from the community. The changes were small but symbolic of a larger shift in how the court system viewed its relationship with the public. Professional organizations took notice of the changes. The American Bar Association invited Mrs. Chen to speak at their annual conference about her experience and its aftermath. She declined to appear in person but agreed to a video interview, conducted in her beloved school library. Her message was simple but powerful: justice works best when it works for everyone. Judge Thompson, true to his word, began working with community organizations. He started by volunteering at an immigrant rights clinic, helping elderly residents understand their legal rights. Many were skeptical of his presence at first, but his humility and genuine desire to learn from his mistakes gradually earned him a measure of respect. The journalism student who had first tweeted about the courthouse incident completed a documentary about the case and its impact. The film featured interviews with court employees, community members, and legal experts, but its most powerful moments came from ordinary people sharing their experiences of feeling voiceless in the justice system. Mrs. Chen's grandson David had become an unexpected advocate for court reform. His technology background proved valuable as he helped develop user-friendly apps and websites to make legal information more accessible to elderly and non-English speaking residents. "My grandmother taught me that progress comes from making things better for others," he explained at a tech conference. The parking ticket that had started it all was long forgotten, but its legacy lived on in countless small changes. Court schedules were adjusted to be more accommodating to elderly defendants. Translator services were expanded. Judges began holding regular community feedback sessions. The system was slowly becoming more responsive to the needs of all its users. 1 year after the incident, Mrs. Chen stood in her garden, tending to her roses as she did every morning. The flowers were in full bloom, their perfume filling the air. A local reporter had asked her if she felt proud of all the changes she had inspired. She smiled and pointed to her garden. "Like these roses," she said, "justice needs daily care. We must all do our part to help it grow." The story of the elderly volunteer who stood up to a prejudiced judge had become more than just a viral moment or a catalyst for reform. It had become a reminder that real change often starts with one person refusing to accept injustice, and that dignity and compassion can be more powerful than anger and fear. 18 months after the courthouse incident, Mrs. Chen sat in her favorite reading chair at the school library, surrounded by a group of eager children. They weren't just there for their usual story time, today was special. A new children's book titled Standing Tall, A Story of Courage, had been published, inspired by her experience. The author had asked her to do the first public reading. As she opened the colorfully illustrated book, she noticed how many parents had joined their children for this session. Among them was a face she hadn't expected to see, Judge Thompson's granddaughter, a third-grade teacher at another school. The young woman had been instrumental in helping her grandfather understand the impact of his actions, bridging the gap between generations and cultures. The changes sparked by that fateful morning in court had taken root and flourished in ways no one could have predicted. The state's judicial system had become a model for others across the country. The Community Advisory Panel, which Mrs. Chen still served on, had helped select 3 new judges, each bringing a fresh perspective on justice and community service to the bench. But perhaps the most significant change was happening in small, everyday moments. The courthouse, once an intimidating fortress of authority, had transformed into a place where all members of the community felt heard and respected. The Dignity Group had expanded its services to include educational programs, legal workshops, and support services for families navigating the court system. David's legal accessibility apps had been adopted by court systems in several states. He'd named the main application Chen's Bridge, in honor of his grandmother's role in bridging the gap between the justice system and the community it served. The app provided real-time translation, simplified legal explanations, and connections to community resources. The former law clerk who had exposed Judge Thompson's misconduct had been appointed to a national commission on judicial reform. Their work was helping to establish new standards for accountability and transparency in courtrooms across the country. They often cited Mrs. Chen's case as the catalyst that showed how one person's dignity could transform an entire system. Judge Thompson himself had undergone a remarkable transformation. After months of volunteer work with immigrant communities, he began speaking at judicial conferences about his journey from bias to understanding. His honest acknowledgement of his failures and commitment to making amends had earned him an unexpected role as an advocate for reform. The school where Mrs. Chen volunteered had become a hub for civic education. Teachers developed a curriculum around the concepts of justice, dignity, and community involvement. The Kindness in Action Club had evolved into a district-wide program, with students regularly visiting courthouses to learn about the legal system and the importance of equal justice for all. One morning, as Mrs. Chen tended her garden, she received news that would bring her story full circle. The state legislature had unanimously passed Mrs. Chen's law, comprehensive legislation requiring courts to provide better access to translation services, cultural competency training for all court personnel, and establishing an independent oversight committee for judicial conduct. The governor chose Mrs. Chen's garden for the signing ceremony, understanding the symbolism of the location. As cameras rolled and officials gathered, Mrs. Chen continued pruning her roses, explaining to a young reporter, "Like these flowers, justice blooms best when we remove what holds it back and nurture what helps it grow." The documentation of her case had made its way into law school curricula nationwide. Students studied not just the legal implications but the human elements, how one person's dignity in the face of discrimination could catalyze systemic change. The video of her court appearance was now used in judicial training programs as a powerful reminder of the impact their words and actions could have. The Mrs. Chen Scholarship had been established at the State University's law school, specifically for students committed to serving elderly and immigrant communities. The first recipient was the daughter of a Dignity Group member, who had been inspired by Mrs. Chen's story to pursue a legal career. As she finished reading the children's book to her young audience, Mrs. Chen closed with a simple message that wasn't in the printed pages: "Remember, little ones, courage isn't about being the loudest or the strongest. It's about standing firm in what you know is right, even when your voice shakes." The children's book reading ended with an unexpected announcement. The school library where Mrs. Chen had volunteered for so many years was being renamed the Chen Community Learning Center, reflecting its evolution into a space that served not just students but the entire community. It would house a new program teaching young people about civic engagement and justice. In her garden that evening, Mrs. Chen reflected on the journey of the past 18 months. The parking ticket that had brought her to court that day was framed on her wall now, a reminder that the smallest moments could lead to the biggest changes. Her roses had never bloomed more beautifully, nurtured by the same patient care she had shown in helping to transform the justice system. The story of the elderly volunteer who stood up to a prejudiced judge had become more than a viral moment or a case study in judicial reform. It had become a testament to the power of dignity, the importance of standing up for what's right, and the truth that real change often starts with one person refusing to be diminished by injustice. Mrs. Chen's quiet courage had shown that sometimes the strongest voice is one that speaks with dignity and compassion, and that true justice, like her beloved roses, grows stronger when tended with care and respect.